Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kies. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, very excited about today's show, and we are going to dive in momentarily, but this is social media, so let's take just 1 or 2 minutes here to do what you got to do when you're talking about social media. Number one, if you appreciate content like this, both my show and the other great shows that are on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, please like, follow, and subscribe to whichever social media platforms you prefer. Now, from our point of view, Truth Be Told Radio Network, if you prefer a video format, we're hoping you're following us on Rumble. If you prefer a podcast format, now you've got all kinds of choices. Simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, click on the podcast tab, and you will see the icons for at least a dozen major podcast platforms. That way you can choose whichever is your favorite. Go there, click there, and then subscribe or, follow the methodology of podcasting that you prefer, because they give you a couple of options on how you want to do things, whether you want it sent to you automatically, downloads, stuff like that. And then finally, if you prefer a just straight up, audio / radio format, then you can simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website and click on the Listen Live Now button. And as I said, that is for God Save the King, but also for the other great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Now, like I said, I really want to dive in tonight, but I gotta tell you something right up front about the diving in, right? There are ideas coming to me as I am speaking. So I am processing this information on the fly here. Now, yes, I'm recording it. I'm not doing it live. So yeah, if I really needed to, I could go back and I could erase this and do it all over again. But more than likely, really what I want to say here is I reserve the right to change my mind. If, as I am processing this information, I get a better idea later tonight or tomorrow or next week, I might come back next week and say, hey, something, I rethought that and I realized this instead of that. And you see, that's the nature of biblical and historical research. Frankly, that's the nature of any good research, is that you always update your information based on the best information or evidence available to you. Over the past 4 years, a lot has been made about, follow the science. Well, science changes all the time, precisely because in good science, you follow the evidence. And if the evidence changes, then the science changes. So when it comes to historical research, when it comes to biblical research, when it comes to scientific research, the better information can change, right? Just for example, many, many, many years ago, there were lots of theories about the quote unquote Star of Bethlehem, that people wanted to make it a supernova or a comet, or things like that. Well, we have much better information now than we did 20, 40, 60, 80, or 100 years ago, not only about what was available astronomically, right? Because, if you did not consider a certain option, right, then how would you know if a certain option wasn't on our radar to even consider, and now it is on our radar? Well, you see, that changes things. And I'm just using this as an off the top of my head example, that a lot of people always tried to make it a supernova because of the fact that it says the star appeared, right? So one way of looking at that is believing that whatever this astronomical phenomenon was, that somehow it had to appear. Well, that would be something that a supernova would do. It's not that it wouldn't be visible beforehand. Potentially it could be, but it would change in appearance because of a star going supernova, right? It would change in appearance. It would appear all of a sudden, it would appear in the sky where it hadn't necessarily appeared before. So that's just one way of looking at it, right? And even though the notion of a heliacal rising has been mentioned for several decades, we now know that the Babylonian celestial observers, even going back thousands of years, that heliacal risings were considered a powerful omen. But we now know that much better than we did even 20 or 40 years ago because of the number of clay tablets that have been translated that have revealed how significant the idea of a heliacal rising was to ancient Mesopotamian observers. See, so I'm just using that as one example of how the research can change over time. See, so for when I first started doing this, when I first started doing God Save the King, it was because part of the evidence that persuaded me to go on this giant research project was someone showed me that the best evidence they had ever seen with regard to what the Star of Bethlehem might be was Revelation 12:1, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet. And maybe that's what the Magi saw, and maybe it's not. Okay. But that was the best evidence I had ever heard at the time. Now, I heard that back in the mid 1980s. So here it is, 40 years later. And although a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet is absolutely still in the picture, it's still a big part of the evidence that tells us when we believe Jesus was born. I'm not so sure that's what the Magi saw. Because, see, when the Magi showed up at the court of Herod the Great, they said, "We have seen his star in the rising, in its rising." That's what it would say in the Greek, not in the east, in the rising. Okay? Now, it just so happens that a lot of things rise in the east, and that's why the two words are interconnected, but the technically correct translation would be, "For we have seen his star in the rising." Well, that is a reference to an heliacal rising. And what a heliacal rising is, if you don't know, it's when a very bright star is initially occluded by the sun. It's so close to the sun that you can't see it. And then, due to the different rotations and orbits of the sun and the earth and the other stars and planets, what happens is while at first it's occluded by the sun, over the course of several days, the two will begin to separate to the point where you can see the star distinct from the sun, which is the word helios in Greek, the heliacal rising of a star or of a planet, right? And since this was such a powerful omen in ancient Mesopotamia, it makes sense that what the Magi saw was the heliacal rising of a planet, the heliacal rising of the king planet, Jupiter. Now, I digress, because all of that was really only intended to be an illustration of how research can change your thinking about what's going on. Because remember, what is the scientific method? The scientific method is supposed to be that you develop a hypothesis, right? Then number two, you develop a repeatable experiment that can be performed under controlled conditions, right? Then you perform the experiment multiple times. Then you record your data, right? And then you extrapolate the data to prove or disprove your hypothesis, right? Now, historical research operates a little differently because you can't develop a repeatable experiment when you're talking about something that happened 100, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 years ago. There's no way you can invent an experiment. You need data from other sources. You need ancient documents or whatever the case may be. But as you acquire more documentary evidence, right, and you get more than one source that tells you the same thing, then you start to go, "Oh, okay, I get it. I see." If I have multiple sources that suggest that the Mesopotamian Magi saw the heliacal rising of the king planet, okay, then that makes a lot of sense. So, like I said last time, this is an example of how evidence can change your point of view. It has mine. Okay, this is a 40-year project, and what I believe 40 years ago, although the vast majority of it has not changed too dramatically, there has been a lot of fine-tuning, about things that I didn't know and understand when I began the research project. So, all of that to say, I started a series last week that I initially entitled something to the effect of the Herodian family murders or something like that. And I have frankly decided to retitle this series within the series, right? I've decided to retitle the series within the series, and I am borrowing a quote. Okay. Now it's funny. I played a little bit of Trivial Pursuit with a friend of mine earlier today, and I said, riddle me this. I'm gonna list 4 famous people, and I want you to tell me which one of them originated this quote. Okay? So the quote is, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Now, who said that? Was it the 5th century BC Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu? Was it the 1st century BC Roman general, statesman, and emperor Julius Caesar? Or was it the 15th century AD Florentine diplomat, philosopher, author, and historian Niccolo Machiavelli? Or, frankly, was it a fictitious film character named Michael Corleone? Da, 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 da. Okay, well, that exact quote is from the 1974 film The Godfather Part 2 and was made by Michael Corleone. Okay, that's who said that exact quote. But in reality, the correct answer is D. Actually, not D. A would be Sun Tzu. B would be Julius Caesar. C would be Machiavelli. D would be Michael Corleone. The correct answer is E, all of the above. They all said it. Okay. Now, Sun Tzu, Julius Caesar, and Niccolo Machiavelli, they did not make that exact quote, but they all said essentially the same thing. Essentially the same thing. Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And so I have decided to retitle this teaching series, Keep Your Enemies Closer, right? Because that is what Herod the Great did. You should be, there you go. See, like I said, I'm a lot of these are ideas that are coming to me as I am speaking. What I should have done is I should have included Herod in the list. Is what I should have done. So here, let's play the game again. Ready? Here you go. So I'm going to list off several major historical figures, and I want you to tell me who said this, right? So A would be Sun Tzu, B would be Julius Caesar, C would be Herod the Great, 4 would be Niccolo Machiavelli, and then 5 would be Michael Corleone, right? So which one said it? They all did, right? Now, I don't know that Herod actually said such a thing, but boy, did he operate that way. He absolutely operated that way. There is no question about it. And what has happened here, ladies and gentlemen, is that I decided it was a good idea to do a teaching series on the different people that Herod killed. Okay. Now, that might sound kind of morbid, and in a way it is. But at the same time, this is part of who Herod is. And that is the point behind God Save the King that you have heard me say over and over and over and over again, is that the purpose of God Save the King is to try to get as accurate and historical picture of the nativity as possible. And unfortunately, we have all heard the quaint little dumbed down, highly commercialized, vastly oversimplified children's version of the Nativity. Okay? It has taken on a life of its own. It is a kind of Christian mythology. Okay? And yes, in the broad strokes, some of the facts may be correct, but in the big picture, this is, and you've heard me say this before too, this is Game of Thrones. And it's not just Game of Thrones, it's Game of Thrones for real, because these were real people. And I started making a list of everybody that Herod killed, because if you go back to the Magi, see, and once again, this is where the title God Save the King comes from. It's a pun, it's a play on words, right? Because God Save the King is a statement that is made to extol the king, to honor the king. See, because in the countries and empires and kingdoms that have had kings in the past, you always wanted a good king, and you wanted that king to reign well and to reign for a long time. Long may he reign. God save the king, right? Protect the king. Let prayers be made for those who are in authority, right? God save the king. We want the king to reign well, right? But if you look at the whole issue of the slaughter of the innocents, Herod sending forth his black ops team to kill the male children 2 years and younger in and around Bethlehem, that would have been very in keeping with his character. And his target was the legitimate true born king of all Israel, Jesus the Messiah, right? So when we say God save the king, that's who we really mean. We really mean the true born Davidic king of all Israel. God save the king. But did Herod fear for his life and fear for his throne? Yes, he did. Did he have yes men surrounding his throne, undoubtedly saying, "Oh, great king, live forever, God save the king"? Yeah, he probably did. And it's this wonderful, twisted historical irony about this guy. And that's part of what I'm really trying to bring out here, and what I want to talk about today. And before I even get to the list of people, because we're going to get there. Don't get me wrong. We are going to get to the list of the people that Herod either killed or had killed or was planning to kill. Okay. We are going to get there. But like I said, these ideas are coming to me as I'm speaking and as I'm doing the research. And what I realized here is you've got these major themes that are woven throughout Scripture and woven throughout history. And see, God, the Bible says that God does not reveal anything that he hasn't revealed to his prophets, right? One of the amazing facts about the Bible, one of the amazing factors about the Bible is how much of it has been revealed in advance. How much of it is prophecy that tells the future, right? Before it happens. God declares the end from the beginning, right? And that's really provocative when you consider that we and he have an enemy. Because in the world of human ingenuity, you don't tell the enemy what you're thinking, and you certainly don't tell them what you're going to do. Oh yeah, I'm going to do this next week, or I'm going to do this next year, right? You don't broadcast it in advance about what you're going to do. And yet that's what the true God has done. He has broadcast in advance what he's doing, when he's doing it, how he's doing it, right? And basically has told the enemy, try to stop me. Try to stop me, because all I'm going to do is prove that I'm God and that you're not, because I'm going to tell you in advance what I'm going to do, and you're still not going to succeed in stopping me. Interesting, huh? So last week, I did a pretty in-depth review of these biblical themes and brought us up biblical and historical themes that pretty much brought us up to about the time of the Maccabean revolt. And I want to try to just bullet point a few of these very quickly, simply to remind you that these themes are running all through the Bible and all through history. Then I want to add a little bit of information that should have been included last week that I didn't get to include, and then I want to start moving into continuing to move forward historically so that we can get to the murders that Herod engaged in, the people that he killed, right? Keep your enemies closer. Keep your enemies closer. That's what he did. So let me remind you of some of these themes. Let me try to burn through this list really quick, all right? So, it all started with what we call the everlasting covenant, and the fact that the eternal council of the Godhead declared in advance that they were going to create, and that why they were going to create and stuff like that, right? That's enough for now. That's one point, right? I mentioned the fact that you've got, Genesis 1 through 11 is epic poetry, right? I mentioned the fact that in Genesis 1 and 2, primarily 1, but also in Genesis 2, right? God is clearly creating a sacred space. He's clearly creating a temple, right? So the language of temple permeates this record, right? He is operating according to covenant, and yet he is building a temple. He is setting aside a sacred space. And what sacred space is for, it's where God and humanity intersect, right? So he has set forth his eternal purpose, which is to dwell with his creation. Now he is building a temple where God and humanity can intersect so that he can go about his purpose of dwelling with his creation, right? So then in Genesis 1, we have God making covenant with humanity to continue this program, right? And then you get these challenges to God's program. You get the challenge in Genesis 3. You get the challenge in Genesis 6. You get the challenge in Genesis 11. And then each time God resets. Humanity falls for it every time. See, God wanted to intersect with his creation, where God and humanity intersect. The Nakash, the Shining One, he didn't like that very much. He didn't like the idea that God was building a sacred space that frankly, and here you go, these ideas, they drop in, that God was in effect building a huppah, okay, for his Ezer Kenegdo, okay? The Nakash didn't like that, so he interfered, right? But God is operating according to covenant. He's operating according to Hesed, right? So each time, even though humanity falls for it and blows it, then God resets, right? So you got the everlasting covenant, then you have the Edenic covenant, then you have the travesty of Genesis 3, but then you have the Adamic covenant, then you have the travesty of Genesis 6, then you get the Noahic covenant, then you get the travesty of Genesis 11, and then you get the Abrahamic covenant. So God keeps resetting, right? So the themes that I want you to remember, okay, are God's eternal purpose, that he wants to dwell with his creation, and he's got to create a sacred space where God and humanity can intersect so that he can dwell with his creation, right? So if you learn to think in those terms, you'll be able to recognize the pattern recognition. And therefore, you will also be able to see when the enemy is trying to interrupt the pattern, because that's the enemy's game. Because God has committed to covenant by declaring the end from the beginning, right? And the fact that God says that the scripture says that God is not a man that he should lie. Okay, God has to keep his word. Well, then, if the enemy can get God to break his word, then he has proven that God isn't God. right? And he wins by default, so to speak. So this is what we see repeatedly over and over and over again throughout Scripture if you know what to look for. God wants to dwell with his creation, therefore he wants to create a sacred space, and then the enemy attacks something about that, right? See, and like we said, everlasting covenant first before creation, declares his intent to create and why he's going to create. Then he gets man involved, Edenic covenant, Genesis 1 and 2, right? Then Genesis 3, you get the interruption. Then you get the Adamic covenant, last half of Genesis 3. Then you get Genesis 6, the Nephilim, the Watchers, and then the Nephilim botch it all up. Then you get the Noahic covenant. Then you get Babel, Genesis 11, and then in Genesis 12, you get Abraham, right? And Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant mentions a land, a seed, and a blessing, right? And then over time, Scripture expands those ideas. So the land is basically the sacred space all over again, right? The seed has two components. Number one, it's the people. It's God dwelling with his creation. Well, his creation are the people. So it's the sacred space is the land. And then the seed, well, that's the Ezer Kenegdo. That's the people. That is his bride. See? But then also the seed takes on a secondary meaning in when it starts to refer to the Messiah. Okay. And then finally, there's the blessing itself. And then the blessing is to dwell with his creation. See, so this is the simplicity of the gospel, so to speak, from time immemorial, is that God wants to establish a sacred space where God and humanity can intersect, and therefore we can dwell together. Land, seed, blessing, dwell with his creation. Right. And then I really want to blow past this quickly because I talked about it last week. I talked about briefly about Jacob and Esau and how, Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac is the son of promise. Isaac begat Jacob and Esau, but you got the whole issue with the twins and the struggling in the womb and the two nations and the birthright and the whole thing. And the fact that the family of Jacob goes to Egypt, the family of Esau does not. Okay, the family of Esau doesn't go to Egypt, right? And if you fast forward, see Herod the Great is an Idumean. He is an Edomite. He is of that lineage of Esau. And what is he doing? He's challenging the birthright of Jacob, of Israel. That's what Herod does. See, so that's how these, if you look for the pattern recognition, you'll see this come back in your face over and over and over again, right? We didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the wilderness because the wilderness is just an amplification of humanity. Because here's one of the other patterns. The other pattern is, will humanity heed God's instruction and therefore be willing to live in an interdependent relationship with God, or will humanity try to live independent of God? Okay? So that choice is faced again over, that's Esau and Jacob. That's Cain and Abel. That's Esau and Jacob. It's all over the place, right? So the wilderness is just an amplification of humanity wanting to live by our rules, of wanting to be independent, right? We got into Judges and the fact that everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and then they clamored for the king. And through the prophet Samuel, God said, no, you don't. But then the people said, yes, we do. So then you had the united kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. Then you had the divided kingdom beginning with Rehoboam. You got the northern kingdom taken into captivity. You get the southern kingdom taken into captivity. And then you get to this run of foreign empires dominating Israel, right? And the first one was Babylon, okay? Actually, it starts with Assyria, right? And very important in the Assyrian captivity, right? Large numbers of Jews were taken out of Canaan and now dispersed through Mesopotamia and Central Asia, right? Then it happened again in Babylon. So the point being is now you've got large Jewish populations outside of the Bible land, outside of Canaan, right? Which is very interesting because weren't the Jews supposed to be a light to the Gentiles? Where they weren't when they weren't really doing what God told them to do. So God said, fine, I'm going to make you a light to the Gentiles, right? So Assyria, Babylon, then you get Persia. And this is really important because it was Cyrus the Great that allowed, frankly, not just the Jews, but any of the captive peoples that were captive as part of Babylon. When he conquered Babylon, he said, you guys can all go back to your homes if you want. It's okay. As long as you pay your tribute, as long as you live in peace, as long as you report for military duty when I demand it, as long as you pay your tribute, you can live your life, right? So under the Persians, the Jews actually experienced an extended period of mostly peace. Mostly peace. Now we're going to come back to that. And then, the Persians got conquered by the Greeks. And the Greeks, of course, introduced this concept called Hellenism, because what the Greeks wanted to do that the Persians didn't. See, what the Persians believed in letting people live their lives, ironically, right? The Jews not so, or pardon me, the Greeks not so much. Strike that. Not the Jews, the Greeks. The Greeks wanted to introduce this idea that everybody be homogeneous, right? That they would, same language, same religion, same culture, and they wanted to enforce it if necessary, right? Now, where I want to get to, what I want to talk about is I want to talk very briefly about, I want to review a little bit about this Persian period and then give you some more insight about the Greeks in light of what is going on back in Canaan under Persian dominance and then under Greek dominance that leads to the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty, which is what sets the stage for Herod. Okay, because if you remember, part of the story here is that Herod marries into the Hasmonean dynasty. He's not a Hasmonean himself, but he marries into that dynasty, believing that it will add legitimacy to his claim, right? So here's a very important point to remember. When Cyrus the Great releases the Jews and allows them to return to the promised land, okay, only a very small portion do so, okay? And they're going back to rebuild the temple. Eventually, they'll rebuild the city. But remember that the Jews, according to the law of Moses, have an hereditary priesthood and an hereditary monarchy that come from different tribes. Now, this is important because this gets into that whole paradigm and paradox of sacred space, land, seed, people, blessing, God's intention to dwell with his people. Because, like I said, God declares in advance, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up a sacred space where God and humanity can overlap so that I can dwell with my creation. I can dwell in and among my people, and that I can be a blessing to them, that I can bless them directly, right? Very interesting, right? So you've got the hereditary priesthood that comes from the tribe of Levi and the house of Aaron. And then you have the hereditary monarchy, which comes from the tribe of Judah and the house of David. Okay. Well, it's not that the house of Judah disappeared, or the tribe of Judah and house of David disappeared. They didn't disappear. They just went into captivity. And then, according to the foreign policy of the Babylonians and then the Persians and then the Greeks, they're not about to allow a Davidic king to come back and sit on the throne. They're not going to allow that. Okay. So it's not that they don't know that they exist. It's not, I mean, the Jewish community in Babylon apparently knew exactly who the tribe of Judah was and who the descendants of David were, and they protected that line, okay, because they knew that someday something might change. But they deliberately did, they knew all this, and they guarded it, and they protected it, and they knew who was who, okay, but they didn't necessarily start going, okay, well, now a Davidic king has to go. See, they didn't necessarily push that button, right? But what was allowed was that the hereditary priesthood returned to the promised land. So when the hereditary priesthood returned, that allowed for the rebuilding of the temple, which allowed for the reinstatement of a high priest. Well, in the absence of a king, it's kind of hard for the high priest not to begin to take on civic authority. And this is a huge key to what is now going to happen from this point forward, right? It's very important with regard to what happens under the Persians, and then under the Greeks, and then under the Hasmoneans, is that the high priesthood is going to become more and more important, and it's going to take on more and more civil authority, civic authority, civil authority, okay? Which, in other words, they're going to move closer and closer and closer and closer to being a king, okay? It's kind of hard not to, because once again, what did I say? Will humanity live interdependent with God according to his design, or will humanity live independent of God and his design, right? And remember book of Judges, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So in other words, independence, right? And then what was the result of that independence? They said, give us a king like all the other nations. And that's when Samuel stepped forward and said, no, you're missing the point. That's not what God wants. It's not what you want. I know you think you want it, but you really don't. Okay, because if and when you have a king, this is what he's going to do. He's going to take a tenth of this and a tenth of that and a tenth of this and a tenth of that. Okay, he's going to take all the really good stuff for himself and leave you with what's left. Okay, so there it is. Independence is what led to give us a king, whereas God's intention was always to be the king who ruled over his people directly and dwelt among them. See? Okay, so under the Persians, I don't want to go in depth on this. Frankly, for one reason I don't want to go in depth is because I can't. This is actually a period of time that I'm not a super expert on. I know it, but I don't know it to the depth that I know other areas about the Old Testament. But this is the Persian period and the high priests in the Persian period. We are not sure whether we have a complete list. Now, part of why we don't know whether we have a complete list is because we're now getting into a time and space in history where names started getting repeated, right? Where you may have had more than one high priest who had the same name, or a variation of the same name, which is very common in Hebrew and in Greek. Okay, so for example, the first high priest coming back after the Persians released the Jews was Joshua. Well, Joshua is the same name as Yeshua, right? Or Jeshua, or Yeshua, or Yeshua, or Yehoshua. They're all different versions of the same thing, right? So now if you get a slight variation later on, and you have historical records that don't keep that precisely clear, it can be pretty interesting to try to figure out whether you've got one or more of the same name. So these are the 6 names that we know for sure were high priests in the 200 years of Persian influence in Canaan, right? And that's Joshua, Joachim, Eliashib, Joiada, Jonathan, and Jaddua. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And you can read about these in Nehemiah 12, right? And even the list in Nehemiah 12 is a little bit jumbled because it's hard to decide, okay, well, that's the list of the high priests, but then it continues to talk about other priests and Levites, and it becomes kind of difficult to keep it straight because there may have been more and they may have had similar names, right? But those are the 6 that we know of that covered about 200 years worth of time. So there's debate whether this list is complete or not, or whether some of the names have been dropped from the list because it was the same name as a previous high priest, right? But this lasted for roughly 200 years, okay? And remember that the Persian Empire gave way to the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great, then Alexander the Great dies, then his generals divide up his kingdom, and then the land of Canaan falls between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. And Israel is right in between. Okay. So now you get a period where you're under Greek influence, whether it's the Ptolemies out of Egypt or the Seleucids out of Syria, right? So now you have high priests under Greek influence, right? And so here we have, 3, 6, 9, 10 more high priests under Greek influence. Now, remember what I said. The high priest is starting to take on civil authority. That happened even under the Persians, and the Persians treated the Jews pretty well, right? Now you've got the Greeks coming in and enforced Hellenization. So now look at what these pieces start to do, how they start to fit together, and the changes that start to happen, right? Because the high priest is starting to take on civil authority. But the priestly tribe is Levi, and the house is Aaron, whereas the civil authority is supposed to come from Judah and David. So when the high priest starts to act like a king, you got a problem because they're not from the right tribe. They're not from the right tribe, and that's a problem, okay? Because God is a covenant-keeping God, right? Well, within covenant, truth is an extraordinarily important component, because if the covenant keepers, the parties of the covenant, want to keep covenant, then you have to know the provisions of the covenant that you are going to keep. And if the covenant is that the priests are going to come from Levi, the high priest from Aaron, and then the rulers are going to come from Judah, and the king from the house of David, then guess what? The king can't come from the house of Aaron. Sorry. Now we know there's some very provocative models in the Old Testament, primarily David, because he operated as both a priest and king. See, and we know that when Jesus shows up, he is going to operate as a priest and king. So there's this very peculiar, what's the word I want to use? Development that God is engaging in within the covenant. But remember, covenant is significant. And so if you've got the wrong names in the wrong place in the wrong column, then it's probably not going to work, right? And so now you've got this enforced Hellenization, like I said, this enforced Hellenization, where the Greeks want their language, their religion, their culture, right? And then the high priest is becoming more and more civil authority, more and more civil authority. Well, they're from the wrong tribe. They can't be, they're not supposed to be kings. Okay. And it's one thing to call yourself a high priest and something else to act like a king, right? Because the foreign empires and then the local leaders within the foreign empires, they didn't really care. They needed a leader, a local ethnic leader who would do what they said. See? Because remember the Persians, what I mentioned about the Persians, that the Persians were pretty easygoing, right? You pay your tribute, you show up for military service, we pretty much leave you alone, right? Okay. Well, if you're going to pay tribute, you got to deliver the tribute. Okay. So you got to load up all that gold in wagons and then you got to deliver it to the king. Okay. Well, how hard is it then if you're the person showing up with the delivery of the gold to influence the decision of who's going to be the next high priest? Okay, because that's exactly what started to happen, is because the high priest started to take on more and more civil authority, the high priesthood became much more of a political appointment rather than a religious hereditary process. Okay, now initially the Jews made sure that the hereditary process was kept in line at least a little bit. But then eventually you get to a point where, now even the high priest isn't from a priestly tribe. He's from another tribe altogether, and it's not Judah either. Okay? You got a problem. You got a big problem. So there is a list, like I said, 3, 6, 9. There's a list of 10 high priests of the Jews who were high priests between the Persians and the Maccabees, right? One or two of them, frankly, overlapping with the Maccabees, okay, that start all from Levi and Aaron. But then by the time you get to the end of the list, they're not from the tribe of Levi anymore. Okay. And I'm not even exactly sure precisely where the changeover came. Because when you get to the end of the list here, well, let me read the list. All right. So number 1 on the list is Onias the First. Number 2 is Simon the First. Now these are high priests under the Greeks, right? Onias the First, Simon the First, Eleazar, Manasseh, Onias the Second, Simon the Second, Onias the Third, Jason, Menelaus, and then Alchemist. Okay. The question mark enters in at Simon the Second. Okay. Onias, Simon the First, Eleazar, Manasseh, Onias the Second, Simon the Second, Onias the Third, Jason, Menelaus, Alchemist. Right. Certain historical records, primarily Josephus, but certain historical records, plus the books of Maccabees and things like that, mentioned that Simon II was not an Aaronite. He was a Benjamite. So he's not even a Levite. He's from the wrong tribe altogether. Okay. Now, do we know this for absolute certain? Hard to say. And and like I said, this was supposed to be hereditary. So a lot of these are fathers and sons, and then you start getting some brothers mixed in as well, right? Okay. So who's who here? Who's a father and who's a son? And wait a second, if Simon II is a Benjamite, then if his father was Onias II, doesn't that make him a Benjamite? So exactly when did the switch come in, right? That's really tricky. When did the switch come in, right? Plus, now, remember, I'm reviewing here. This is very important. The Greeks want Hellenism. They want one language, one religion, one culture. The Jews, they don't want any of that. They don't want to. Now, the elite begin to embrace Greek as a language because there's benefit to that. Okay. See, and that's the flip side of this, right? Because the Greeks, in many ways, there's no question that they represent human wisdom, right? But it's very appealing. It's very attractive for certain reasons because all of a sudden, because you see, you got Jews scattered around the world right now. And yet Greek provides them with a way to communicate. See, so isn't this interesting that the Jews are supposed to be a light to the Gentiles? They don't really do what they're supposed to do. So God says, here, let me help, and leads them into captivity, right? And then bombards them with a culture that is not their own. So they'll all learn a foreign language. So now you've got Jews in Mesopotamia and Jews in Spain that speak the same language because they speak Greek. Interesting, right? So very, very, very interesting. But like I said, the Greeks, they want this Hellenization. So it's not just a fight between the Greeks and the Jews, because now what you have happening is you've got Jews that favor Hellenization. They like the language. They like the culture, right? They like things like theater that get brought in by the Greeks and things like that. And the learning, the intellectualism and stuff like that. There's some tremendous appeal and benefit to the Greek way of doing things, right? So some of the Jews are like, well, yeah, let's do that. Let's go along. Let's go along to get along, right? So now the problem becomes between the Hellenizing Jews and the devout Jews. Because the Hellenizing Jews, they're like, oh, it's fine, it's all good. Let's speak Greek. Let's get along with our Ptolemaic and Seleucid overlords. We'll be fine. As a matter of fact, we're not even worried about the fact that the high priest is a political appointment. We're not worried about the fact that, well, hey, you know what? When we deliver our tribute money to the king, we'll just add a little extra and therefore we'll influence who he chooses. See, and that's what starts happening is now you've got Hellenizing Jews influencing the Seleucid kings primarily, right? And bribing them for who to choose as high priest. So it becomes strictly a political appointment available to the highest bidder. So that is very interesting because now you've got a corrupt high priesthood. See, so when Mattathias rolls along, because Mattathias and his 5 sons, they're the ones that instigate the Maccabean revolt, okay? And they are devout Jews apparently from the tribe of Levi and the house of Aaron. They are legitimate priests. So they do not like the fact that you have high priests that are bribing their way into that position and then utilizing it as civil authority. See, so I think that's the point that I really wanted to get to tonight, is that when you lead up to the Maccabean, see, because people who know about the Maccabean revolt, they know about Antiochus Epiphanes and the fact that he tried to basically outlaw Judaism, right? And he made certain facets of Judaism just straight up illegal and punishable by death, right? But the other part that they don't see is that you've got a large representative body among the Jews that are a Hellenizing influence. They're going along with the Hellenization, right? And that the high priesthood is now corrupt, and that you can bribe your way into the high priesthood, and the high priest is the de facto king, and they're not from either of the right tribes. So what have you opened the door to, right? What have you opened the door to by the fact that you the right tribe isn't represented. They bribe their way onto the throne. You have just opened the door to that when Herod shows up 100 years later, you can put an Edomite on the throne of Judea, and some people will just go, okay, well, there it is, right? There it is. Okay. So this, I wanted to add that information as we head into the Maccabean revolt. That's what we're going to start talking about next week. And the fact that now you're going to get Jewish high priests again from priestly families, but then we're going to watch what happens to them. We're going to watch what happens to them and what it's going to pave. See, because you can see what's going on here, right? They're not keeping the purity of the faith, so to speak, with the right tribes and the right roles. It's all beginning to get corrupted. It's getting contaminated, and it's incremental. But each time another increment gets added, it gets worse. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. I do have to wrap it up there. I'm really thankful that you had the opportunity to join me tonight on God Save the King. And we're going to continue next week with Keep Your Enemies Closer. God Save the King.